Hallo, liebe Zuhörende, da sind wir wieder im KOSMOS Winterkino, das Moderatorenteam aus Christoph Schneider und
Theresa Frommen. Hallo an
ja,
alle.
ja, heute haben wir einen tollen Vortrag mitgebracht, der 2019 im Rahmen von der KOSMOS-Konferenz zu dem Geburtstag von Alexander von Humboldt, seinem 250. im August, lief als Planetary Lecture, also als Vortrag für das gesamte Konferenzpublikum, nämlich den Vortrag von Johann Rockström. Und da geht es um Planetary Boundaries und die Frage, wie es möglich sein wird im 21. Jahrhundert und darüber hinaus für uns als Menschheit innerhalb dieser Grenzen globaler ökologischer Tragfähigkeit zu bleiben. Ich finde ein total spannender Vortrag. Theresa, wie hast du den Vortrag wahrgenommen?
Ja, ich fand den auch sehr spannend und sehr informativ. Und ich glaube, dass für Menschen, die sich mehr mit der Idee der Planetary Boundaries, der planetaren Belastungsgrenzen auseinandersetzen wollen, das ist ein sehr hilfreicher Vortrag, weil Dr. Rockström wirklich viele Sachen erklärt und viele Begriffe auch nutzt und sie in Zusammenhang setzt und sehr viel Informationen gibt. Also vielleicht lohnt es sich auch, den zweimal anzugucken.
Ja, ich glaube auch, dass der Vortrag von Johann Rockström einfach einen total guten Einstieg und einen total guten Überblick gibt über das gesamte Thema und es auch eben so Fragen wie Klimawandel oder Biodiversitätskrise in so einen breiteren Kontext einbettet. Und ja, insofern freue ich mich auf den Vortrag, freue mich, dass Sie dabei sind. Und jetzt hören wir mal Johann Rockström zu.
Thanks, Christoph, and good morning, everyone. I should say, though, that what makes me most proud is to have the honor of giving a talk at the Humboldt University at this KOSMOS conference at the 150-year celebration of whom I would call the world's first Earth system scientist, Alexander von Humboldt. So as a professor in Earth system science, I'd feel at home, and I think this is really significant. What I'd like to do is, over the next 40 minutes, give you scientific justification for a new definition of sustainable development. I'm sure that Alexander von Humboldt would have been able to do it already in the 1780s, that now we're talking about prosperity and equity within a stable and resilient Earth system, and that is the pathway for the future for humanity. And that this will take me to the point where I promise you I'll try to answer this question: is sustainable development within planetary boundaries a utopia or a panacea? Now, the drama of this lecture can be summarized in actually just a visual. And of course, this is something that has been on our eyes and lips for quite some time now with the 50-year celebration of the Apollo 11 mission. This is actually the Earthrise picture taken at the Apollo 8 mission. Every astronaut who has been giving testimony to having seen this in real life says it's a reconfiguration of the brain. You simply reconnect to the planet, this little beautiful blue marble out there in the margins of the universe. The problem is that we cannot all be astronauts, so we cannot wait for the world to understand the preciousness of the Earth system for our own future by taking us all to space, even though Richard Branson and a few others think that that might be the path. Now, science is a proxy for this. Science tries to tell the evidence-based story of what astronauts have been seeing when they photo the Earth rise. And the drama is very significant. We have all the evidence, I would argue with zero uncertainty today, that it's in the last 50 years that we have changed conditions on Earth as they have prevailed over the last 10,000 years. That is an unequivocal statement. What is perhaps a little bit more related with uncertainty, but I would argue increasingly with high precision, is the more dramatic following, that what happens in the next 50 years will determine the outcome for the coming 10,000 years. Now, if this is correct, if the evidence which is pointing in this direction is correct, it means that we are now standing on the knife's edge. Most of us, well, actually no, I'm just looking at myself here, have been part of the journey into the point where we are. So I'm the first to put up my hand and give my testimony. I am one of the culpable. I admit that I've been part of the journey, the great acceleration that took us unsustainably to the pressures on the Earth system that is putting ourselves at risk. If I'm in good health, and most of you in the room, we will be actually part of the large part of the journey out of this point. So it's for this generation right now to stand up and take responsibility for the transformation towards an equitable and prosperous future for humanity on Earth. This is the moment. This is why youth in the world have all the reasons for concern. It's not only about the frequency and evidence of extreme events, which I won't list here because you know them so well. It's not only that we've reached 1.1 degrees Celsius warming, the highest temperature on Earth since the last ice age. We are bumping the ceiling of the stability of the Holocene. In the last 5 years, we have the 4 highest temperatures ever recorded on planet Earth. But it's not only this, it's actually that we're starting to understand the changes. You may know that at Yale University, Tony Lizerovitz and his team does opinion polls every year and has been doing that for 10 years. Below the media noise that gives this impression that even in the US, there's this polarization on climate change, year after year, roughly 70% of US citizens are worried about climate change, trust climate science, and want climate action. This applies for all the European countries, it applies for China, it applies for India. This is very reassuring. So when youth steps up with the Fridays for the Future, with Berlin being the ground zero in the world, I would argue. Yesterday I had the privilege to have a long phone call with Louise Neubauer. I think you should be so proud of what you have in youth movement here in Germany, preparing for the 20th of September, which will be the grand planetary endeavor for the youth movement in its next step in the run-up to the Antonio Guterres Climate Summit in a few weeks' time. Her message is the following: we might be hitting a glass ceiling of enthusiasm among the youth because the youth are demonstrating and they don't really see big impacts. What are the results? Now is perhaps the time for what has already happened but could actually be an argument to ramp up even further, the science for the future. Because the beauty of the youth movement is in fact that they stand with 2 cards that nobody else can play in any negotiation. They have the future, but they have truth. Because they only say one thing: we want you to implement what science says, and science has officially expressed their support for the youth movement. So something is happening, business is moving. You've all seen this graph, I'm sure. This is the risk report from the World Economic Forum. You have on the y-axis the perceived from business leaders impact on their business, on the x-axis the likelihood of this impacting, and up at this right-hand corner you have the high impact, high likelihood events that could risk business and economy. And as we know, now it is climate change, biodiversity loss, water scarcity. Everything that has to do with the Earth system is now at the upper right-hand corner of business perceptions on risk. So we're seeing a trend line here, and science is corroborating this. I would argue that these are the 2 most important scientific reports we today have on the table: the IPCC 1.5 report, which came last year, and the IPBS, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the first, or the second actually, global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services and their role for human well-being. The drama in this latter report you all know. We are at a 60% loss of species on Earth, according to the latest Living Planet report. And according to the IPBS, we are threatening 1 million species on Earth of the 8 million known species. 30% of the species, by the way, are hosted in the Amazon, which is now on fire, and largely parts of it on fire because of President Bolsonaro's inability to take responsibility for one of the Earth system regulating biomes on the planet. This is work in progress. This is for a paper that we hope will be published in just 2 weeks' time in the Climate Summit. This is what science has been communicating over the past 20 years. What you see here is the 4 latest IPCC assessments. So the TAR is the 3rd assessment. Then you have the AR4 in 2009, the AR5 in 2013, and the 2018 SR 1.5. You've seen these red embers diagrams. You have temperature, average temperature on Earth on the y-axis. The redder, the higher is the evidence base on risk that we risk at those temperatures to tip the systems across thresholds. You see on the furthest left unique and threatened systems like ecosystem collapse. You see in the middle extreme events, and then the one that gives the biggest worry on the furthest right, what the IPCC has called the large-scale discontinuities. You could call it crossing tipping points. What you see here is very dramatic. Look at the red shading in the furthest right from 2001 to 2018 in terms of how the risk of disastrous change is going down. In 2001, we thought that the risk was at roughly 4 to 5 degrees Celsius warming. Today, the risk level goes down to 2-3 degrees Celsius warming. This is what happens. The more we learn, the more reason for concern we have. So it's a very clear message today that when we in Paris had 200 nations signing on to the Paris Agreement, the numbers staying well below 2 and aiming for 1.5 were not some kind of arbitrary numbers related to what the economy can deal with in terms of an applied discount rate or what we can, so to say, adapt to. Oh no, these are biophysically hardwired numbers. These are numbers that indicate that if we go beyond 1.5, we start really triggering irreversible change. If we go beyond 2, we again risk even more irreversible change. The land report that came just a few weeks ago supports this even further, showing the risks we have from water scarcity to the left to food instabilities, going down in temperature. So the deep red here across the lines is between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius warming for impacts on land related to climate change that will impact world development and sustainable development goals in a very dramatic way. So there are some insights that have been advancing over the last 30 years that takes us, in my mind, to a new paradigm for world development on Earth. Let me just share you quickly the 3 insights that brought us to the planetary boundaries, which I think should guide whether you take a planetary boundary framework or whether you take another one, which should guide our future on Earth. The first one, of course, is that science welcomes humanity to the Anthropocene. As you may know, the Anthropocene Working Group has now decided, voted formally, to define that we have now reached a new geological epoch. So this is now formalized and set. The Anthropocene, as we all know, is not some kind of hypothesis. It's based on the observations of the hockey stick patterns over the last 150 years. So on the x-axis here, you have from 1750 till today, and the hockey stick patterns is just to show you that it doesn't matter whatever parameter you pick. On the green side are the pressures on the Earth system from deforestation, carbon dioxide emissions, nitrous oxide, eutrophication, overfishing, biodiversity loss. They have the same pattern. Up until a certain point, we have limited impact on the Earth system, and then bang, off we go in the mid-1950s, the point of the great acceleration. But there is a further drama here. And the further drama looks as follows. Here I take the same curves. You have the time axis here from 1750 until today, and I'll just flip them through how they look like. Here you have the northern hemisphere temperature, population growth, carbon dioxide concentrations. Here you have deforestation following the same curve, GDP growth. It's a mix of social, ecological parameters. And you see the trend line. They all look the same. They bend in 1950, fish exploitation, ozone depletion. And the key insight here is that, yes, we entered the Anthropocene in the 1950s. But it seems, according to the latest science, that the Earth system is so resilient that even through unsustainable exponential rise in pressures, that delivers in a phenomenal way to human well-being. I mean, I have full respect for the late and dear colleague of mine and friend, Professor Hans Rosling, who always made the point that, look here, the world has become so much better. We've moved from 3 billion people in 1950 to 6-7 billion people today, and we've never lived so long, and we've never had such good lives in terms of access to food and fundamental components of human well-being. But it seems increasingly like this happened entirely at the expense of the planet, and moreover that the planet was able to deliver without sending its own invoices back to the economy. There was enough redundant forests out there. There was enough redundant species for ecological functions. There was enough redundant fish. The atmosphere could absorb enough greenhouse gases. The ice sheets were so stable, even if they started melting, they still had enough albedo reflective capacity. The Earth system was so resilient. Increasingly, and this is an hypothesis, I would argue that from 1990 onwards, we start seeing the scientific evidence that we may have reached what I would call now the saturation point. That we hit the ceiling of the point where the Earth system starts losing resilience. And there's so much ample evidence around this, and I won't go through the list here, but we have the classic, the collapse of the codfishers in Newfoundland, tipping points of freshwater systems, the Baltic Sea tips over, we pass 350 ppm, the Arctic sea ice accelerates, we have the ozone, stratospheric ozone layer reaching a point of of fierce emergency, what takes us to the Montreal Protocol, it seems like the last 25 years is the period of saturation. Now, I mention this particularly because evidence also shows very clearly that the timeline between science being established and really unequivocally convincing and action is roughly 25 years. That's very depressing, by the way. But it seems to have been the same case when it comes to links between smoking and cancer, between acid rain and tree death, between freon and chlorofluorocarbons and stratospheric ozone depletion. This is a report by United Nations Environment Programme, already 12, 13 years back. The title being How Late Response to Early Warnings. What if this is almost like a coded genetic inability of humanity, that we are not able to react faster than a 25-year lag time? Well, if you count 25 years from 1990, where do you come? 2015. What happened in 2015? The Paris Agreement. What happened in 2015? We adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, the world's first roadmap for a people-planet agenda for humanity. What if we have turned a corner? What if we have, as Professor Carl Folke at the Stockholm Resilience Center says, reached a new renaissance point that is now inevitable? We are in a kind of in an Alexander von Humboldt way, having a new paradigm of understanding that the Earth system is now a precious necessity for our pathways forward. I would argue this is a plausible hypothesis. I would challenge us as scientists, perhaps the Humboldt University, to really put some evidence behind this. The second piece of evidence is, well, if we're putting all this pressure, are we leaving the Garden of Eden? Are we tipping the planet away from the point where it can support humanity? I would argue that we today have a lot of evidence in support to precisely define what's the desired state of the planet. You've seen this Milankovitch curves of the 1.1 million years of 110,000 years cycling between ice age, 100,000 years, and interglacial. We've had 6 to 8 such cycles of the last 1.1 million years, forced by orbital forcing each time. So these are natural variations. This is the last cycle from the Eemian 120,000 years back up until the Holocene today. If we kind of zoom into that last cycle, it looks as follows. This is from the northern hemisphere. This is data from Greenland. This on the y-axis is temperature variability. And over the last 100,000 years, picking out that 100,000 years because it's a good choice, because we've been modern humans on Earth roughly 100,000 years. So we've had, let's say, the same ability mentally and physically to develop civilizations as we know it. And you can just look at the graph to see that it was a bumpy ride indeed. You know, we had tremendous fluctuations of temperature and living conditions on Earth during this time. The temperatures could go up and down 10 degrees Celsius on average over a decade. We had a very rough time. We were hunters and gatherers, a few million people struggling to survive until we leave the last ice age and enter the small period you have here in the red circle, this extraordinarily stable Holocene period. You all know as well that we barely enter this. And what do? We do the most important invention of all. We leave our hunters and gatherers life and domesticate animals and plants. We become sedentary farmers. We establish villages, societies, and off we go in the innovation pathway that took us to the 1950 point of the Great Acceleration. So the scientific conclusion is as simple as it is dramatic. The Holocene is the only state of the planet we know for certain can support our modern world as we know it. If we take any ethical responsibility, the Holocene is our reference point. We can live outside of the Holocene. We've done it before. We've been like a few million people. But if we really want to say we have 7 billion, soon to be 10 billion co-citizens, human beings on Earth with the same ethical rights to good lives, I would argue we have ample evidence that the Holocene is our Garden of Eden. That is very good news, actually, because we know the Holocene very well. We know the composition of the ice sheets. We know the composition of all the geographic biomes. We know the cycles of nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, water. We can actually define quite well what's the safe operating space to stay within the Holocene. That is what took us to the planetary boundaries. But that's just insight number 2. I just want to make this point because climate skeptics love to say, well, but you know, within the Holocene period, we've had so tremendous variability. It's not so stable at all. I mean, the Vikings, they grew, you know, grapes on Greenland 1100 and 1200 because of the warm medieval period. Well, look at this. All the variations that we've had in the Holocene, definitely. We have the Little Ice Age, we have the medieval warm period, we have the Roman Empire climate optimum, has been variations within this ±1 degree maximum variability on Earth. The Holocene is a very stable interglacial with its natural variability, but within which we have been able to develop. We now bump the ceiling to 1.1. We're exiting the Holocene. Insight 2. Insight 3 then is, well, how does Mother Earth respond with all these pressures? Well, we today have ample evidence, I would say again unequivocal evidence, that she does not respond as we have assumed. It's not as if things just change linearly and incrementally and thereby predictably, which, by the way, is the basis for all economic modeling, for all economic assumptions, and for every discount rate you'll ever read about. The reality is the complete reverse. The resilience of the systems, from local lakes to large West Antarctic ice shelf or the ocean conveyor belt, is that they can take pressures and stress over very long periods of time, but then abruptly shift direction, potentially even show regime shifts or state shifts when they cross certain thresholds. We have mapped this over time, and this is just a video showing a little bit of the listing of these, which are systems, the tipping elements on Earth, from the permafrost that is locked into the Siberian and seabed, from the Arctic sea ice systems. You recognize even the regional weather systems like El Nino coming to the Amazon rainforest, another tipping element that stores carbon and has moisture recycling, regulating your systems. Coral reefs being a part of the ocean stability, the Southeast Asian monsoon, the jet stream, which I'll come back to. We have today quite a large advancements in Earth system understanding of the tipping elements that regulates the state of the Earth system. We communicated this to Patricia Espinosa and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for the first time in Bonn at the Climate COP meeting with the following graph. And I think this is the graph that every climate negotiator should basically hold in his or her hand. 20,000 years on the x-axis, average temperature variability on the y-axis. Here you see how we exit the last ice age and we enter the Garden of Eden period, the stable Holocene period. Here you have the Paris Agreement. Just a quick reminder that even if we succeed with Paris, we're outside of the Holocene range. So it's not as if Paris will be a return to some kind of oasis. It will also have adaptation challenges. This is where we're heading, according to the IPCC. And you know that even if we apply the NDC, implement all the promises that nations have given, we'll probably be beyond 3 degrees Celsius warming, a place, by the way, we haven't been in for the last 5 million years. But here's the key home message. This is the latest update. No, it's not even the latest update. It's a recent update of what science says in terms of uncertainty ranges. The redder, the higher the likelihood, but the uncertainty range is the width of these columns, in terms of at what temperature ranges are we at risk of crossing tipping points for these Earth system regulating tipping elements. I'm particularly focusing on this group here because you see the scientific evidence dips into Paris. It actually shows evidence that even at 2 degrees Celsius warming, we cannot exclude anymore of destabilizing the West Antarctic ice shelf, 3 to 6 meters sea level rise, destabilizing the Greenland ice sheet, 7 meters sea level rise. Look at the coral reefs. They are in the entire uncertainty range within Paris. I would call this the first planetary victim, and we have it on the table today, that even if we succeed implementing Paris, we're very likely to leave a planet for our kids and their kids without tropical coral reefs on Earth. This is a very dramatic situation, and this is where science is standing today. If you put all this together, we've entered a new geological epoch. The Holocene is our desired state, our reference point, and tipping points in nonlinear change cannot be excluded. That takes us naturally to a new framework. Because, of course, the next natural step for science is then to ask, well, if we need to stay in the Holocene and we're putting pressures up at this biophysical ceiling, what are the processes that regulates the state of the Earth system? Question 1. Question 2, if we can find those systems, can we scientifically quantify boundaries within which we create a safe operating space where we have a high likelihood to stay in a Holocene-like, interglacial, manageable state that can support humanity, but beyond which we risk triggering nonlinear changes and feedback that could gradually take us in the wrong direction. There you have it, the Planetary Boundary Framework. Published the first time in 2009, identifying 9 systems that we proposed to the scientific community. We were able to quantify 7 of them. We gathered 40 scientists from all different disciplines, from soil science to oceanography and climate science, defining and trying to define, and what you see here in yellow is the uncertainty range, and red is when we start moving into a pace where we cannot exclude of triggering nonlinear dynamics. They were published the first time in 2009 and then followed up in 2015 with an update. Today our conclusion is that 4 of the 9 boundaries are in a danger zone, and we need to rapidly transform ourselves back into a safe operating space. I can share with you that already in 2009, the climate boundary, one of the 9, was defined a little bit below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. It took 10 years for the scientific community at large to actually basically corroborate what was published already in 2009 in terms of the importance of 1.5, which was not even understood in Paris. Here are the 9. I won't go through them in detail. For those of you who are interested, please read about this. But it could be just good mentioning that, of course, the boundaries include what you could call the big 3 systems, the systems that are perfectly mixed, operate at the global level, the obvious ones for everyone, the climate system, the stratospheric ozone layer that protects us against dangerous levels of UV radiation, but also the energy conveyor belt and the whole ocean system. What is perhaps a little bit more surprising is that 4 systems are the biosphere systems, the living biosphere that operates under the hood of the Earth system and regulates the ability to sequester and dampen, or that could shift gears and self-reinforce. Biodiversity, land systems, fresh water, and the 2 let's say, brother-sister cycles to the carbon cycle, namely nitrogen and phosphorus. And then we have two boundaries that are entirely alien. We call them a bit nerdly in the working teams because they're created by us humans. Novel entities, which is everything from nuclear waste to microplastics and organic pollutants, and aerosol loading, which is our interference with the optic depth of solar influx due to black carbon and larger particles of pollution, which, for example, we see today when forest fires changes temperatures and rainfall patterns regionally. Now, these have been corroborated, they've been updated, and we're aiming for a next update in 2020. So all suggestions and ideas are more than welcome. The coordination from this is done at the Potsdam Institute and the Stockholm Resilience Center. This took us then to the next level of analysis, which is at what point are we at risk on the climate boundary to trigger potential cascades of change that could really move us away from a Holocene state? We published last year what we call the Earth trajectories in the Earth system, trying to ask the question that if we allow ourselves to burn fossil fuels up until 2 degrees Celsius warming, what are the risks that the biosphere might start kicking in feedback changes? Could that trigger a runaway pathway? This paper, for the first time, stipulates as a challenge for science that we cannot exclude that that is the case. In fact, our conservative assessment is that 2 degrees Celsius warming from fossil fuel burning would bump us up to 2.4 degrees Celsius warming, roughly, due to forest dieback, due to permafrost thawing, due to changes in the biological pump in the ocean, and due to a relative decline in CO2 uptake capacity in oceans and soils. A very careful assessment, but we are afraid that that could then be linked with the tipping elements shown on the map here, and that it could lead to a cascade in which in Germany was then baptized as the High paper, which is the risk of us triggering something that could take us inevitably in the wrong direction. So we're talking about 3 different states of the Earth system fundamentally. We have the desired interglacial, we have the glacial state that we know so well, and we haven't been beyond these 2 states actually for the past 1.1 million years. We don't really know. We're going into terra incognita by thinking of what happens moving in a direction to the right there. But it's also that colleagues at PIC, Andrzej Galopolski and colleagues, published a paper a few years back saying that probably, with a high likelihood, we have actually emitted so much greenhouse gases that we're unlikely to ever again enter an ice age, or at least not in kind of, let's say, time scales that matter for humanity. So it might be that the only remaining path is either we remain in a manageable interglacial state, or we are at risk of pushing ourselves across the threshold, which would be a warming state. Now, the good news is, and the important thing to recognize is that given that that is the risk, are we at risk of pushing ourselves towards a warmer state, that the Anthropocene is not yet that state? The Anthropocene is a pressure. We're still in the Holocene in terms of the biophysical dynamics that keeps us in an interglacial position. The Anthropocene so far is a pressure, and the big challenge and task for humanity is to avoid that the Anthropocene becomes a new state. But the Anthropocene Working Group that has decided that we're now in the Anthropocene is showing very worrying scenarios, which is here shown in this Anthropocene pathway, that over the next 1,000 years, we could actually trigger exactly a hothouse Earth trajectory. And after the hothouse Earth paper, this paper came out by Burke et al., which I find also supports this whole, let's say, risk landscape. And what you see here, I think it's a phenomenal graph, even though it's a bit messy, but it has the last 60 million years. It's logarithmic, so you see it a bit in chunks. And further to the right, you have the yellow there is the Garden of Eden, the 10,000 years of Holocene stability. To the left there, you have the 1 million years of Milankovitch cycling between Ice Age and interglacial. Then you have the pathway we're following, and you see the 2,100 point is 4 degrees Celsius warming. Let's assume we reach 4 degrees. I mean, the business as usual pathway. That would actually take us, there you have the 4 degrees Celsius line. You know, that would take us back to a point where we haven't been for the past 10 million years. So according to the latest paleoclimatic research, we are at risk of winding back the climate clock, not kind of 1 million years or 2 million years or 3 million years, but over 10 million years. That's just to show that in a blink of time, this is an experiment at a scale that we have never experienced before. Then came, just a few months back, this paper by Willett et al., also at PIC, which I find to be very humbling, which is that according to the latest knowledge we have and the modeling work we have, the average temperature on Earth over the past 3 million years has never exceeded 2 degrees. So again, despite all the variation, it seems like the planet has had this self-regulatory ability through biophysical, biosphere, and climate physics to stay within this very, very narrow limit cycle of -4 to 2 degrees. And then we have these indications of large changes. The changes in the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Ocean Circulation, the jet stream transitions. You've all read about the risks that the jet stream related to changes in the pressure gradient between the Arctic and the equator. Maybe the explanation of why heat waves and high precipitation pressure systems get locked into Europe, explaining potentially 2018, 2019 heat waves in Europe, but also a remarkable synchrony between California wildfires and the Japanese heat waves and floods with this bizarre behavior of the jet stream. We have more and more evidence, unfortunately, which I mentioned earlier, of rapid Antarctic melt. So there's a lot of support that this risk pattern of potentially moving out of the Holocene is real. That's why I would argue that a scientific challenge for us is really to move ahead on what I would call Earth resilience, to understand and explore more what is it that defines the ability of the Earth system to remain in a certain state. What are the feedback dynamics of all systems, the living and non-living systems, that can stay within this stabilized Earth system and avoid, you know, that humanity and some kind of human push takes us across the threshold toward a hothouse. This was a systems diagram in this Earth Trajectories paper that tried to illustrate and challenge science on exactly this journey. And we would very much welcome, let's say, an integrated whole Earth system analysis to try and understand that, you know, we seem to be out at this slippery red slope here, where we are gradually reducing the resilience of the Holocene cup, which is in the beginning, in the furthest background here. And of course, our big task is to try and navigate back into stabilized Earth, which is all about human and environment working together as planetary stewards. And that requires a combination of resilience thinking with sustainable development. So what does this all mean then in the last 5 minutes for the future? Well, to begin with, I do think it redefines sustainable development. I think we can no longer just think of reducing environmental impacts on you know, economic capital, natural capital, and human capital. We now need to really consider humanity's future as prosperity and equity within a stable and resilient Earth system. We also need to understand this is a transformative journey. The Ipcc is actually quite clear. We actually need a transformation. in the 1.5 report, we've never seen this before, so clear to say that the green pathway that can take us safely back to a safe operating space is by cutting emissions by half over the next decade. This is why the German decision in the Coal Commission is so important. This is why von der Leyen's promise now to have a European Union net zero pathway for 2050 is so important. That is why Germany, as the fourth largest economy in the world, is so fundamental, because if Germany can show that you can have good prosperity, have a peaceful development while phasing out particularly coal, this would be the signal to the world to succeed. We have translated the science into carbon law, which is very simple. It is about following this pathway of reducing emissions, which translates, of course, to kind of 6–7% reductions per year, but also translates to something very simple, inspired by Gordon Moore. You know, Gordon Moore, who stipulated in a predictive way that the speed of computers would double every 18 to 24 months, which became a self-fulfilling prophecy of innovation in industry. Well, there's a carbon law here to say that if we cut emissions by half every decade, we follow science. So it's interesting that this was published well before the Ipcc report, but that is now the message from the unequivocal base of science. Cut emissions by half next decade. Now, we know that that's not enough. The brown part here is agriculture, which needs to go from source to sink. We know that not even that is enough. We need to, whether we like it or not, consider negative emission technologies at a very large scale, at a worryingly large scale, up to 20 gigatons of carbon dioxide per annum by the end of this century. And then we need to keep the resilience in the Earth system intact. The green and the blue is the ability of natural ecosystems to take up greenhouse gases. If we do all this, we have a, I'm sorry to say, 66% chance of reaching 1.5. So this is our task. It's a global sustainability transformation. It's not only about the energy transition, it is about reconnecting to the entire planet. Now, yesterday we published a paper to support this in Nature Sustainability. If you haven't seen it, it's led by Jeff Sachs. It's part of something called the Wohlstand 2050, identifying the 6 transformation areas that we believe are potentially sufficient to really deliver on all the SDGs while meeting the Paris Agreement, to try and instill some energy and injection of the potential. This is not utopia. This is definitely doable, because behind all of these areas of the digital revolution, smart city planning, a food transformation, decarbonizing energy systems, we have solutions. We actually even presented solutions to the Global Climate Action Summit last year. We'll do an update in a few weeks with Christiana Figueres on our ability to cut emissions by half over the next decade in so many sectors. This is done together with Project Drawdown. There are technologies that can take us to cutting emissions by half this decade, which was the message and increasingly supported. We have so much empirical evidence here as well, and Germany is part of this, of how solar voltaics and wind is increasing from a very low number. So the last 15 years, it looks as if it's a very small part. It's only 2.8% of the energy mix. But actually, if we just continue business as usual, which is doubling every 4.5 years, we would actually have 50% of electricity in the world from solar and wind by 2030, if we just keep the current pace. So we are an exponential curve. We're following an exponential curve on so many of the, oh, thanks. Yeah, he's getting worried, which is correct, but I was fine. We see so many countries today decoupling economic growth from greenhouse gas emissions, roughly 50. That's an interesting number, because already Pareto, several hundred years ago, showed that, you know, if you want to cross the valley of death, when you go from startup to really penetrating a market, you need to reach roughly 20% of consumers or market penetration. And that's what we're reaching now. 50 is 25% of the number of countries. On the right hand, you have roughly 50 countries in the world have adopted a price on carbon. Everyone says it's impossible to adopt a price on carbon. 50 countries have done it. Not the right price because Sweden has the right price, of course, which is 100 euros per ton of carbon dioxide. But talk to Professor Ottmar Edenhofer. We're in very close collaboration and dialogue, actually, with the climate cabinet here in Germany to discuss how to move forward on a science-based price on carbon. We recently worked on food in the Eat Lancet Commission, trying to define with a planetary boundary framework for the first time healthy and sustainable diets to take us back to a safe operating space and increase the life expectancy of people. Our estimate is actually saving 10 million lives per year by eating healthy food, which is reducing red meat, a more mixed diet. It's not a vegetarian diet, but it's a more healthy diet. And if we apply this so-called planetary health diet within definitions of planetary boundaries, we find, and this is quite a messy graph, but this is the question, can we feed 10 billion people by 2050 if we eat healthy food produced in a sustainable way? If we go like business as usual, the top line there, it goes red everywhere, meaning that if we continue as today, we fail even on Paris just by eating in the wrong way. So even if we decarbonize the energy system, the food system on its own will make us fail Paris. But look at the furthest down here. If we invest in sustainable intensification, prod plus, if we reduce food waste by half in the middle, and if we start really adopting on a big scale healthy diets, we can go green and yellow at least. We can go back into safe space on all the planetary boundaries studied here, which is water, biodiversity, nitrogen, phosphorus, and climate. So it is not utopia. We see that prosperity and equity is something that can be done. We have a challenge here. This paper was fantastic, I would argue, from colleagues at Leeds University, showing that countries in the world, in all the circles, these are all the countries in the world, and on the x-axis is the number of planetary boundaries that they are transgressing. So the further to the right, the worse you are on sustainability. But on the y-axis, you have the number of really good social indicators that are met. So the further up you are on the y-axis, the better is the life satisfaction, the better is the GDP, the better is equity levels. And what you see is, up to the right-hand corner, you have Germany, Sweden, the OECD bloc. So we have to admit that still, 2019, we are delivering, those countries are succeeding, are delivering on human well-being at the expense of the planet. We're still in that mode that took us into the Anthropocene. Nobody is where we want to be. Nobody is actually succeeding within planetary boundaries. So, I mean, the challenge is enormous. The SDGs provides us the framework. I would argue that it should look like this. It's not a Swedish smorgasbord where you can just pick your little goodies and choose your favorite goals. We have to understand that there are 4 non-negotiable goals. Goal 6, 13, 14, 15. Fresh water, biodiversity, oceans, and climate that provide scientifically based planetary boundaries within which we can have aspirational goals for humanity. I think that's the new paradigm we need. We're working on this. Right as we speak, we have the so-called Earth Targets for Business today, which is a global commons alliance with the Global Environment Facility and the World Economic Forum and others, trying to define scientifically based targets for businesses and cities in the world based on science. We're now launching an Earth Commission, which is like an IPCC for the planet, to try and define quantitative scientific targets for a safe space to provide scientifically based targets, not only for climate, because as you may know, over 700 companies are today adopting scientifically based targets for climate. Carbon budgets, for example. Now is the time to go for biodiversity, for water, for nitrogen, for phosphorus, for all the systems regulating the planet. This is ongoing as we speak with a large support and momentum. It's really exciting. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development is very, very deeply engaged in this. We have the World in 2050 that I've been reporting before, coordinated by IASA, the International Institute for Systems Analysis, with a large support from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, exploring transformation pathways to meet the SDGs within planetary boundaries. So there is work going on, and I think that to me, the final closing message I'd like to leave with you is I think this is the way to think of the paradigm, that yes, it is about the SDGs within a stable and resilient Earth system. So on that question, whether sustainable development goals within planetary boundaries is utopia or panacea, I think it's neither utopia or panacea. I think it's a necessity, and I think it's an opportunity. And I think there's so much evidence in support of that. The drama right now is not that there are people questioning this and denying it. The drama now, there's so many people sitting on the side, not moving, sitting on the side quite passively. So on my door, every morning when I go into my office in the Karl Schwarzschild's office at the Potsdam Institute, this faces me each morning. And I think it's quite healthy to be aware of this, that the world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but those really who watch them without doing anything. I think that's the point we've reached today. We need to start really moving at a much wider scale. And that is why this dialogue here, and inspired by the great champion of them all, Professor Alexander von Humboldt, is so exciting. Thank you very much.
Ja, Theresa, das war jetzt Johann Rockström, ein fulminanter Vortrag mit so viel Information.
Ja,
Was ist bei dir nicht hängen geblieben, sondern was hat dich beeindruckt?
also eine Sache ganz am Anfang finde ich ganz schön, den Einstieg, den er hat, wo er sagt, dass die Astronauten und Astronautinnen einen Schalter im Kopf umlegen, wenn sie von außerhalb auf die Erde gucken und dass man das auch irgendwie für andere Menschen schaffen muss. Und das finde ich ist ein schönes Bild, so damit kann man so ein bisschen arbeiten. Das fand ich ganz schön. Und dann am Schluss hat er nochmal gesagt, dass die Menschen und die Umwelt zusammenarbeiten müssen, um sozusagen die Beschützer des Planeten zu sein. Also er sagt das ja auf Englisch, aber das fand ich auch nochmal so ein Gedanken, den man verfolgen sollte, okay, dass wir nicht die Zerstörer sind, sondern versuchen, die Beschützer und Beschützerinnen zu werden unseres Planeten.
Mhm. Ja, es ist ein starker Vortrag. Ich meine, für mich ist es auch ganz spannend, wie er das schafft, dieses Konzept der Global Planetary Boundaries zusammenzubringen mit den UN-Nachhaltigkeitszielen. Und dann gibt es ja diese berühmte Grafik, die im Englischen wird sie als Wedding Cake Figure bezeichnet oder als eben Hochzeitstortengrafik, wo die SDGs eben nicht so alle 17 einfach als Vierecke nebeneinander angeordnet sind, sondern so ringförmig und dann das Fundament, die geoökologischen orientierten Sustainable Development Goals und dann die anderen darüber. Kann man total lange diskutieren, ob das sinnvoll ist und klug ist, so eine Hierarchie aufzubauen und wie rum die Hierarchie eigentlich ist. Ist das 17. ganz oben jetzt das Wichtigste oder die 4 unten im Fundament? Aber überhaupt mal das zu schaffen, zwischen den SDGs und den Global Planetary Boundaries diese Verknüpfung herzustellen, das finde ich total stark. Ja, also das war der Vortrag mit Johann Rockström. Total spannend. Nächste Woche geht es spannend weiter. Wir haben die Rechtswissenschaftlerin Anne-Christine Mittwoch zu Besuch, die über Fragen von Nachhaltigkeit in der Rechtsprechung und den Rechtsprinzipien unseres Rechtssystems spricht. Bis dahin, eine schöne Woche.
Tschüss.